Hello everyone, and welcome to Cardinal Directions, the show where three dudes band together to talk about the craft of being a dungeon master, share their successes and their failures, and hopefully learn together with you what they can do to improve. Additionally, we just like talking. This is episode 3, where we talk about some of the best homebrew rules for D&D, such as triple teaming or reverse range combat. Well, get yourself a snack, get yourself a drink, and without further ado, welcome to Cardinal Directions, guiding you on your journey to becoming a better DM. Let's get into the episode. Welcome to Cardinal Direction episode 3. Today we'll talk about house rules. Axel, take it away.
Alright, so today we wanted to talk about house rules because plenty of tables have different house rules. Some of them are bad, some of them are good, some of them are debatably good or bad depending on your tastes. And we figured it's important to know which ones you should include in your campaign. Last time we talked about session 0 and starting a campaign or an adventure. And this is going to be an important part of starting your campaign, knowing what rules are going to be applied and making it clear for everyone involved that you're going to be using these rules or not. So, we have today two beautiful categories of rules that we wanted to talk about. The first ones will be combat rules, and the second ones will be just all the other rules, because we're very organized. Talking about combat rules, Nick, you had a splendid idea about a beautiful house rule that you'd like to talk about. So go ahead.
I can't believe you're putting me on the spot like this.
It's a good one,
But
Tyler.
it is true, though. The rule that I thought about is quite beautiful in the way that it really makes ranged combat useless. Because I've not used this myself, but I've read about it and I've heard other people use this, is where it's inverted ranged combat rules. So you know how ranged weapons like bows or darts have little numbers and feet behind their name. For example, I think darts have 20 feet and 60 feet, and those usually indicate where you have disadvantage regular rolls, you know. But on the inverted ranged combat rule, it means that between 0 feet and the first range and darts that's 0 feet to 20 feet, you have disadvantage, and between 20 feet and 60 feet you have regular rolls, and after 60 feet you have disadvantage again. That's pretty much the inverted ranged combat rule. And what do you guys think about it? Because I read it online, so I'm really interested. I already have my opinion on it when I read it first, but what do you guys think?
Well, I think it's terrible, but like, where would you even use this? What system did you take it from?
It's called Dungeons and Dragons, Pat. It's what
Okay.
this
Well,
podcast is all about.
I can think of one application that will make sense to me, which is like if you have an early firearm, like a pistol. They were used like in close quarters, like in melee combat. They would just fire off and then drop it and grab a sword or something. And then they would be good at close range, but they're not very precise, so it would be really bad.
Right.
Or actually the other way around. So, but I don't see how it would benefit the game or it would make sense physically. Like, the rule is just dumb.
Yeah, it is. Because I went into this podcast with the expectation of us doing 2 rights, 2 wrongs, and then we didn't. And I'm like sitting on all these wrong things that you shouldn't ever do, right? And I need to get them off my chest, which is why I started with this rule.
Well, let's see if there's like any saving grace for this rule. So basically what it does is you get advantage in your first increment of range, right? Or disadvantage, sorry.
No, that's
disadvantage,
there's
and
no
then you have
advantage. There's no advantage with this rule.
Yeah. So basically what it does is it makes you worse at close range and then
With a ranged
better at, longer ranges. Which is a concept that's been, if you look at some other games like XCOM, for example, in XCOM, if you have a sniper, they're going to have a lower chance to hit if they're very close to a target. So it kind of makes sense
Right.
for some weapons, but then for others, like a dagger, why would it be, easier to hit someone who's like 25 feet away than someone who's 10 feet away?
That is so true. I think if you adapted that rule and made it, for example, darts, it's like the perfect example. Like, why are you better at throwing darts from more than 20 feet away? Those things are tiny. You need to be closer to be good at throwing darts, at least in like a manner that does damage. Wouldn't you think so? But with bows, or like long bows, I can sort of understand the sentiment. It just seems that whoever thought of this rule, and I'm not wanting to offend anyone here, it's just not that well thought out. Like you've like it's a very specific application where it makes sense.
I think you could have. I was thinking, how can something get more precise while the further it is, and maybe things that you can throw like a net or a bola. It has to unfurl or have like space to go, so maybe that could have a better
Right.
long, still short range overall, but better long than short range. Because if you're within 10 feet, it's hard to net someone maybe.
Yes.
Um, or like maybe a siege engine would have very bad close range attack.
True.
But I mean, on the scale of D&D 5e battle map combat, seems hard to put
Yeah.
in use.
On that point, even I have to retract my previous statement. Even with a bow, if you stand 15 feet away from someone, you shoot them with a bow. That's still going to be very harmful. In fact, that arrow's probably going to fly faster than anyone could ever dodge. Right. So in fact, it makes more sense to be somewhat close with a bow.
It's funny because in D&D, you have only one rule about distance, more or less, which is if you're in melee with someone, you have disadvantage on range attacks. But there's so many systems which give you like point-blank shot bonuses, actually. If you play Warhammer, I think it's actually good to shoot someone from 5 feet away because it's harder for them to evade it.
Absolutely. And I think in Pathfinder, it's a feat that you can take, point-blank shot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where I think it does something different, though. I think it means that you don't have disadvantage.
Gives you
if
+1.
Your allies.
If
+1
if they're within 30 feet.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I thought it's the one where, like, if your allies are next to the target, you can still hit it.
That's a precise shot. Yeah.
That's the one. Yeah, so many shots.
Yeah, that is true. So many feats.
Good thing we're playing D&D.
Yeah.
Shout out to Pathfinder.
One thing I wanted to talk about is I have actually tried having 3 range increments for one weapon in my new campaign for a great bow. Basically, I was thinking like I wanted a bow that is more powerful but also more unwieldy, right. And so I was thinking maybe if the target is within 60 feet, they're maybe moving a bit too fast and you don't have time to like set up the bow and adjust. But one problem I had with that is then like most D&D combats happen pretty close and you generally don't have like 150 feet or 200 feet between you and the enemies, or in that case it's generally narrative combat more than initiative combat. And so I just felt like it wouldn't get use. Like it just would never be used, actually. Either you have to put like a smaller range increment, or I feel like the concept is interesting, having a weapon that's designated for a certain range, and if you're closer, it's troublesome. But I don't feel like it helps the game enough, and it makes it interesting enough. Mm-hmm.
You have a lance in D&D that's somewhat similar.
It is
where
true.
It's the best at exactly 10 feet away.
True.
Yeah.
And otherwise it's pretty useless.
But yeah, that's what I was gonna say. The lance is not used by a lot of people. But I think that also...
you could make a really cool OP lance and try and balance out the disadvantage advantage.
That's true.
But do you guys think, right, to come to a conclusion on ranged combat, I actually like rules as written for ranged combat. I don't mind. I don't need to house rule ranged combat. What do you guys think?
Well, at least...
Or is there because you're more experienced than I am, right? So you've come across more ranged combat, I assume. So, like, is there an aspect that you don't like with ranged combat?
I'll let Pat start.
Well, the ranged combat dominates the game because more often than not people do ranged attacks when you think about it. With either spell or a weapon. Spells don't have 2 ranges, but weapons do. I think it's fine. I mean, the rule is a clear um, detraction from the rules, the homebrew rule that we're talking about. I think there could be improvement made. Sure, you can make cool different weapon designs, like Axel suggested. It was in his campaign. The thing is, you can complicate stuff a lot, but there's more complicated systems for it. D&D 5e was supposed to be simple. You already have cover mechanic.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's fine.
I would agree. I think ranged combat in D&D is, you have ways of mitigating it through, as a DM, through terrain and through the way the monsters react and act, if you find it boring or if you find that it's dominating the game in general. In a small dungeon with 5 feet corridors and that are like 20 feet long at max, you're not gonna be able to use a bow effectively. But then I feel like it's a good state because it's not too crunchy. There are a few modifiers. Cover, for example, is one you can play with, but then it's not, as we said, because we, in Pathfinder, it's not like you don't have 20 floating modifiers that you add to your roll depending on X and Y and Z. So I think it's in a good state. I would also say it's just better to not include the inverted range rules, but you know what? It's a good example of sometimes making things more complicated just makes them more complicated, not better.
There's a very fun word for that in German, which I'm not going to mention now because we probably don't have a German audience. But if you're interested in looking it up, hit us up on Twitter at Cardinal Direct 3.
Perfect.
Well, moving on from this, maybe a house rule actually is useful. I think I implemented, I think other people probably did too, the secret rolling of death saves for characters. I usually let the player roll secretly so I can see and he can see and hope that he's not going to spoil it for everyone else. But you could even go a step further and just you roll and you don't let anyone know. But I think I owe it to the player for him to know if his character is dying or not. So I leave it at that. What do you guys think?
Do you want to start, Axel, or should I?
Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I've been waiting on this one because I really like that rule. It's an interesting twist that you allow the player whose character is dying to see the result. I've never thought about it that way, but I have to agree. I think it's a good idea to let at least a player know if his character is dying. And it keeps the tension high for the rest of the party. They don't know if their friend is dying or if he's surviving. Do you actually do commentary? Like, do you tell him, like, he's not looking so well, or he's like losing a lot of blood when he fails a save? Or do you just not mention it at all and just show the roll result to the player?
Well, what happened? Perfect example happened 2 sessions ago in my campaign. My players were fighting a creature that was spewing acid, and one of them was unconscious, and he got caught in AOE of the spewing acid.
Right.
And they already had like 2 death saves, negative, and that was the final one. And but nobody knew what the outcome was except for me and the player because they kept rolling. Could have been good, could have been bad saves. And the tensions were high. I think 2 healing abilities were wasted on that player before the battle was over, before they come over. I didn't tell what had happened. They were too far away. It was like, also the area was like obscured, so it made sense that I wouldn't be sure what's happening. But then they come over and I described that their like faces melted away and you could just see a skull sticking out from the helmet.
Right. So you described it after the fact when they were able to see the body?
If someone came over to make a medicine check, maybe it would be obvious that they're dead. But no, it was all like healing words from far away, so there was no way they would know.
Because you mentioned it was obscured. But Axel, if it wasn't obscured, would you roll that as well? Because I'm thinking, like, because this is a rule that establishes more tension in its core, right? You want more tension in the combat, so you do secret death saving rolls. And I'm thinking, can I make the stakes even higher by not telling them, well, he failed a death save and showing them, but by telling them, well, he failed a death save, and I'm telling them, if someone asks how the character's looking, where he's losing a lot of blood, even without a medicine check, right? Because they're just glancing at him. But like first glance impressions, what do you think?
I think it's a good rule overall. You gotta keep in mind the consequences of having it in place, which is because the players don't know that someone is actually succeeding on their saving throws, they're gonna spend actions to try and heal the person most of the time. So in the best of cases, they're not sure if you succeeded, whereas usually they would know. And so they'd be like, okay, he's got 2 successes, we're fine for the moment, we got at least 1 round. And worst case, he rolls natural 1, we gotta heal him, but for the moment, we're fine. With this rule, you never know, so you gotta spend the action to heal, and it won't always... most of the spells will heal you and make you go back up, but it won't always be that way. Sometimes, they're gonna be poisoned by a spider, and the poison reads... If the target is reduced to 0 HP, they're unconscious for an hour, even if they're healed. So basically it adds tension, but it also makes combat harder in a way, because you have to spend the actions. And one thing you gotta keep in mind as a DM if you're using these rules is that they will make people die more. Because there's gonna be situations where people would have made different decisions if they knew how many death saves one person had, succeeded and had failed.
Right. Man, you really caught me out there, because I didn't even think of what happens if they make a death save. I just assumed everyone fails theirs.
Yeah.
I think usually people die if they're not like some failed check and fall into lava or massive damage. They usually die from, I had 1 fail and I rolled natural 1. I think, on a death save, because if someone has 1 fail, you're not really running to heal them yet. It's a little bit dangerous, but like, they'll be fine. But if you don't know, then after 2 rounds, you're like, well, they might be their last one.
Exactly.
Any moment now.
Exactly.
So do you actually hedge your bets? Because I'm thinking also from a role-playing perspective, if it negates metagaming in the way that you're hedging your bets on, well, he'll probably survive, he'll make a save. And as a character decision, if my character was so inclined, I'd rush over right away. I don't care.
Right. Well, I think sometimes, low level especially, in more difficult games, like right now I'm playing in Tomb of Annihilation. I'm playing a Shepherd Druid, and I'm a level 3, and the encounters are crazy difficult. We are 4 players only, and I just have to really make sure that my resources are well spent, and maybe that turn I have to do something else and not heal. But if I know someone who has like 50% chance of dying next turn, then I might be inclined to heal instead. So it's not even always the best decision to heal. But also the other way around, it makes you play more reasonably. Like, oh, my friend is down. Doesn't matter how close to death he is. I'm gonna heal him right now.
Yeah,
That's
sense. What I like about that rule. It's a lot more.
It does make a game harder, definitely.
It makes the game harder, but it encourages more roleplay even in combat, which is a very mechanical-driven aspect of D&D.
I agree, 100%. It makes stakes higher, and it also gives that narrative. What would I say? Basically, it makes sense because usually combat is kind of like this very different game because the narrative is uncertain. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what people are going to do. In combat, you know the rules, and the rules give you this safe space where you don't have this uncertainty. The only one is you're going to roll like a natural 20. But this gives narrative tension within the combat, which I really like. So overall, definitely. What's our conclusion on secret death saves?
If you want the game to be harder and more exciting, like more tense, yes. If you're playing with new players, maybe let them metagame a little. Also, let them know the rules as well, because if you roll secret death save, they might not learn.
That is true.
How death save
That's also a very good point.
That is very true. Yeah, with new players in general, I'd probably be more conservative in the amount of house rules I introduce to the game. But on the rule we just talked about, I totally agree with Pat. I personally love the rule. I'd make it part of every game I was in if I could. And if you describe stuff happening to the character on a failed or made save, pretty much up to the DDM, I would probably do describe if a player asked, like first glance, if a fail was saved. No, other way around. If a save was failed, if a save was failed, if there's something happening with the body, so they could tell, right?
Yeah.
Keeping in mind, like, and in spirit, the more narrative focused aspect of combat there.
All right. So you have a kind of a middling take of if you use it, make sure that the players can get information and have a way to know whatever's happening in game. All right.
Pretty much.
I think we went around pretty well, explained the positives and negatives. So let us shift to the next rule. And because these ones were pretty long, let's talk about a quick one for this one. Frequent one that is used by many tables, healing potions as a bonus action. I use them. I use this rule. What about you guys?
Go on, Nick.
Well, Pat, you know that I'm using this. And Axel, you know as well, because you're both part of my game where I am using this, right? So, for starters, in the official rules, using a healing potion in combat is an action. And in regards to action economy, if we think about this, it makes not a lot of sense, because it's, 2d4 of healing?
Plus
like
4,
lesser
plus
healing?
2, yeah.
Yeah. Right? So, like, you're essentially giving a free turn to your enemy, and most likely the damage that you healed away will be inflicted upon you next turn anyway. So there's not really a lot of point in taking a healing potion during combat, which is why I really like this rule where drinking a combat potion is a bonus action.
I agree. I think we're unanimous. I mean, making this rule, a homebrew rule, into your game changes a healing potion magic item from very situational item for classes with no access to healing, or like an ability to extend the battle, prolong the battle, to an item that is just good to have and is just a way to turn your money into advantage in combat. In a very non-power gamey way, because eventually you run out of healing potions, and some classes have something to do with a bonus action, but it's a good way to spend your bonus action. In my game, it's a bonus action to drink it. I imagine you have them like you have like a bandolier on your armor, and you have them like ready to pop and drink. But administering the potion to someone else, to an unconscious person on someone on the battlefield while they're swinging a sword, I would call it an action. If you're giving the potion to someone else, if you're just drinking it, bonus action is fine.
Yes, I wanted to add the second part of the rule being the giving to someone else is still an action, so there is a cost of like popping your teammate back up, but for yourself as a healing, because if you take into account the amount it heals, 2d4 plus 2 on average is going to be 7. So at what level are enemies unlikely to do 7 or more damage during their turn, which would invalidate the healing potion and make, for example, dodging better? Pretty much, unless you're level 1, and even then, a goblin can easily do more than 7 damage with a crossbow. So I would say overall this makes combat more dynamic because you have more ways of healing. It helps parties that don't have a healer, a dedicated healer like a cleric or a druid. And I think it also makes sense. In previous editions, for example, in Pathfinder, taking a potion is a move action, which I think also makes sense because it is, it's pretty swift as an action. Basically, I think we kind of went around. What last thing I wanted to talk about was what Pat mentioned about gold.
Right. Just interjecting here because it's funny that you mentioned the dodge action.
Yeah.
And I don't want to lose this train of thought.
Of
In the same vein, you could also make it that instead of a bonus action, drinking a potion is a dodge action, which is similar but even less OP in a way.
Yeah.
Right. It keeps the action economy a level playing field.
You're basically doing like a defensive maneuver while drinking. Is that what you're talking about?
Pretty much, yeah. No.
Okay.
Yeah. Exactly.
Like spin around and drink at the same time.
Yeah. Like
a fairly bad idea. Just
just
turn
do
around
a
from your
twist,
enemy to drink something.
Like
it'll be fine.
Chugging a potion, right? Just twisting away.
I think that makes sense. It's definitely less powerful than having it as a bonus action. But it is a good halfway point if in your campaign you don't want to have this, you feel like having a potion as a bonus action is a bit too powerful, and you want to tone it down a bit. That could be a good halfway point for your thing. That's a very good point. The Pat had mentioned one point earlier about spending gold and healing potions being a way to turn gold into something useful, into an advantage. And I think this is very important because in D&D, there's this, I guess, habit or tradition of giving gold to the players, but a lot of new DMs or a lot of DMs that didn't really research that aspect of the game don't really have things to spend gold on in their campaigns, unless you have magic item shops, but that might not be available in every setting. And for example, in my settings, usually it's rare and specific individuals craft specific items. They take a long time to craft, so there might not be a huge amount of stock, and they're pretty expensive. So the players can either save up for a big item, or they can spend in small increments having healing potions that actually give them some utility and function as a gold sink in a way. After every adventure, they're gonna go to the alchemist, spend 500 gold on healing potions, and they're gonna feel good about it. And at the same time, the rewards you give and the money they make is useful. So all in all, I think it's best for the DM and the players. That was just my recap on this last point. All right.
Very concise. I should employ you as a recapper for everything I do.
You do, kind of. All right, so healing potions.
I'm not paying him. I'm paying him in exposure, which is why we're doing this podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So,
what about?
Go ahead.
Are we continuing on healing potions, or?
No. You can switch it up.
Okay.
There's more on healing potions.
Next episode. What about them critical hits, everybody?
Indeed.
So how do you critical hits? Do you just do double the dice? Do you roll the dice twice? Do you give them one full damage of dice and then a dice on top of it?
Lots
there's
of
one
dice
rule
going
that.
on here.
What's up?
Lots of dice going around here.
What's that going around? I mean, a critical roll, for example, they just double whatever they roll. So if they roll 2 1s, then the crit is gonna be 4 damage. Pitiful. But I've heard of a house rule that I haven't yet started using, but I might do. Where you count the max damage they could have done with an attack, and then roll the dice again. So you have one good hit in, and then also some extra damage on top, which seems very OP. And you also would have to do it to monsters, which seems to make certain abilities very deadly. Like if an enemy is casting a what's like a powerful 2-hit attack? Let me think.
Like a cyclops. Yeah. Or like disintegrate. Oh no, disintegrate. I think is a save.
Disintegrate is a save.
Like a boulder throw from a cyclops or something. It's 4d12 plus like 8.
Yeah. So a crit would be more than 50 damage and then 4d12. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, I think I actually got a lot of experience fiddling with crit rolls, exactly because basically my problem with rolls as written is you can do what you said. Imagine you're shooting with your crossbow, you roll a 1, you have a +3 modifier, let's say, you're doing 5 damage on a crit. That's terrible. That feels bad as a player too when you roll a 1 on, especially if you've got big dice. If it's like d12s or something like that, you roll a 1, it just feels terrible. So I tried thinking about like using max damage for crits, but the problem is this gets crazy and you end up one-shotting people all the time, especially PCs. And if you want to have monsters that do a bunch of damage, like, if you want to use a dragon at any point, a crit from the dragon with max damage is gonna do around maybe 80 damage on a tail attack, for example, which is a lot. Like, it's really a lot. And too much, I think. Especially at low levels, it can make your PCs just die instantly a lot of the time. And then there's the half damage, or one part of the crit is max, and then you roll the dice, which is still a lot for me. So one thing I ended up on was having always one dice, usually the bigger one if you're rolling multiple ones, be max damage. So let's say I'm using a great axe, it does 1d12. If I'm critting with it, I'm doing 12 plus 1d12 plus your modifier. And I feel like that makes it good enough so that you never feel like your crit did nothing. It does at least something. But then, with crazy amounts of dice, it doesn't get completely unbalanced in a way. Like if you have 10d6 as a rogue, you're gonna do 9d6 plus 6. But if you have a lot of dice, in general, you can expect the average to be somewhere.
That really messes with like Assassin Rogue if he just gets a +5 damage to his crit basically instead of double all the sneak attack.
Oh,
I would say that's like case on case basis thing.
The way I meant it was you roll the extra damage as well. You just have one of the dice
you roll
of the extra
dice,
damage.
but you also
yes. So if you have like 5d6, just for the others, so it's a bit clearer. Let's say I'm an assassin rogue. I hit someone sneak attack 5d6. I'm gonna do, instead of 5d6, I'm gonna do 5d6 plus 4d6 plus 6.
Plus 6, yeah.
And that way, you at least have one dice that's the max, and it doesn't feel awful, but it's not broken either. What do you guys think about it?
Pat, please go ahead.
I think it makes the Great Axe very viable option. I think it's fine. I think it's a good way to handle it. And because it's just one die, it's not crazy for the monsters, which is what I'll be the most afraid of. I don't have a problem with it as it is. I don't mind if I crit with a monster or if as a player I crit and it just so happens to roll lower than average attack damage. It doesn't feel like a crit, sure, but that's like also a good thing in a way because then base crit chance technically lower than 5% because you can roll nat 20 but still don't deal extreme amount of damage, but you can. So I like the randomness and the variability of the dice. I like that the fireball can be like 20 damage or 40 damage, and I don't mind it being completely out of whack. But I think it's a good rule. If you and the players want to have the feeling of crits being powerful, perfectly fine rule.
Agreed. I definitely like the feeling of being powerful, especially when you crit, because on Roll20 or any other virtual tabletop, rolling a nat 20 gets like a nice color,
Yeah, it's green. It's a beautiful green.
Green light.
Like, yeah, it's like, it just gives you like the go ahead, makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside. And also, you don't have to give the monsters the same advantage that you give to the players.
Yeah.
Just that. But don't tell anyone, because that opinion is very frowned upon, or so I've heard.
Yeah, I think the advantage of this rule is that if you give it to the monsters, it doesn't break anything. It makes crits more impactful, but usually, it's gonna be like 10 more damage, or, well, let's say on average you're rolling d12s, it's gonna be like 6 more damage on average, or even less than that. So, but it just gives it that oomph. And the last thing I wanted to actually mention about that is it balances some of the weapons a bit better. Because usually people use great swords a lot more than great axes, unless they use them for flavor, because just numerically they're better. They got better average damage.
They're more reliable.
Yeah, and they're more reliable. And so that gives you a reason to use a great axe, because with the great sword you only max one of the d6s. Whereas with a great axe, you max the d12, so you do more damage on crits. So, it's a small factor that balances things, but if you, as a DM, you like having weapons with weird damage dice and trying to, fiddle with that to make it interesting, that's a rule you can easily implement. Well, we just talked about crits, but there's one rule that actually Nick presented to us a bit earlier that was also interesting, in the same vein that as the first one he proposed. What about Nick? If you lose half your HP in one turn, would you like to explain this rule?
Oh, right. Yeah, I proposed so many rules, I was kind of stumped, like which one you meant. Yeah, that one's funny, because if you take half your max HP in damage in one turn, you roll a con saving throw to not be knocked unconscious. And I like that rule because it makes combat more realistic, where you get such a hard knock that you're dazed or knocked unconscious if you don't make your saving throw. And I know we've all seen Hollywood movies and people punching their faces 3, 4, 5, 600 times and nothing happens, and they're like breaking bottles over their heads. But let me tell you, not from my own experience, but in real life, if you get hit in the head, you're done. Shit, that hurts, and you won't take more than 1 or 2 blows.
All right. So, in a way, it's a rule that makes it more realistic, which I agree with, and
Yes.
makes combat a lot more tense. But Pat, would you talk to us about the problems that you can immediately see with this rule?
Well, first of all, depending on how you interpret hit points. Because if you read, I don't remember if it's PHB or DMG, hit points are not your health. When you go
True.
to 0, that is when you actually get hurt for the first time. That's the super strong, like arrow to the heart, uh,
Yes.
slash across the chest. When you're depleted, like level, I don't know, level 10, you have 100 hit points. That's when you get that final. Before that, all the hit points are scratches, bruises, and like close calls. Like whenever that firebolt actually hits you, it barely singed you, really. Hit points represent the running out of luck for the adventurer until you get to 0 hit points.
Or
In
it's
that
like
sense,
stamina, right?
Yeah, or being
yeah,
tired, not being able to block the next
Mhm.
blow as much.
in that sense, the rule doesn't make sense. But if
True.
you describe the hits as actual hits, like you want to be cinematic, your hero's getting 5 arrows to the chest and still going. And it makes it cooler as well. I mean, you think of a
True.
barbarian, he's supposed to go through pain, but he's just getting scratches. His rage isn't that impressive. Um, I think, yeah, if you describe the hits. Oh, sorry, go.
No, I was just gonna say for barbarians, I imagine it's just like when they're raging, their pain threshold gets so high that they don't even feel anything. Like they can have
Right.
5 arrows in the arm and it hurts like a motherfucker. But they're just going.
Right.
I'm gonna
So,
beep that
so if you
out.
subscribe, so if you subscribe to this like way of describing things, um, then half health, half max health, right? That's what we were talking
Mm-hmm.
about. It
Yeah.
it makes sense, but is it fun rule? I don't think it's a fun rule. I wouldn't want to be hit for half. If you're a wizard, you're gonna get hit for half your health every time you get hit, almost.
Yeah.
Um, and then you're unconscious and you lose concentration on your big spell, and you need to be healed. I think from as is, the combat is not balanced for people going unconscious after they lose 50% of their HP.
True. Yeah, that's one of the downsides that even I saw. There is the possibility of you being taken out of combat very, very quickly and not being able to get back into it, and you're just sitting there 12 rounds twiddling your thumbs.
Yeah. I agree. I think one of the things is when you implementing a house rule, there's gotta be a reason for it. There's gotta be something you want to make more fun or easier or more interesting in the long term. And you gotta ask yourself: is this fun? Is this balanced? Is this gonna make my life as a DM 20 times harder? And I feel like this rule is gonna do that because it makes combat so volatile. Let's imagine you're fighting a level appropriate threat, like you're level 5, you're fighting a CR 5 or 6 enemy. They're probably gonna be able to knock out almost anyone in one turn if they focus their attacks on them. um, Especially the classes that have low hit points, and these ones are generally the ones that don't have high con bonuses because that's why they have low hit points. The rogue, the ranger, the wizard, sorcerer. So they're basically gonna be the ones getting punched and getting knocked out immediately, and then the marshals are probably not gonna take so much damage, so they're probably not gonna be affected as much. So I feel like it really hurts squishy classes a lot more than the other ones.
Um, there's another rule that I could jump off to immediately,
Mm-hmm.
which is similar to this, which is the um, when you go down, for example, or where you get hit like by huge damage. You don't go unconscious or whatever, but you could have lasting injuries, like from being knocked down or recritted or being like hit by a certain damage threshold. And it has the same problem. It just players being crit by monster happens way too often, and even if you have a con save after it for the lingering injury, It's gonna happen all the time. I watched like a game streamed on YouTube, and a guy got to level 5. A guy was basically blind. He was like specialized in perception, and he rolled on a table to lose one eye, and now he has disadvantage on his best skill. I mean, he went along with it, and his character is cool, but I don't think it makes the game fun.
Rule of cool, right?
Yeah, it makes it problematic. I think lingering injuries, maybe leave it to like have a disease or a curse that's gonna be a lingering injury, because you can, and maybe it's so powerful I need to dispel it at a higher level. But that makes there's a reasonable reason for it to be there, and maybe you can foreshadow it. Having just randomly be critted and lose an eye is what the fuck? I mean,
I think one of the biggest problems for me with lingering injuries is that it is contrary to the narrative of D&D in general. You're a band of heroes who goes and fights demons and other massive creatures, and you do crazy stuff all the time. You risk your life, you almost die every day. If you get lingering injuries, first of all, you're never gonna get to like level 12 or anything like that unless you level super fast, because by then you'll be a cripple. And it also it's against, at least at my table, it's against the feeling of being a hero, being a bit special. It makes it more gritty, which you can appreciate, but I feel like the implications are too much in terms of balance, and in terms of character agency for it to be really a benefit. Nick, what do you think about it?
Well, I proposed the rule, so.
But do you have any particular thing you like about it?
Well, what I like about it is that it makes combat more realistic. But I think you can make it better with the lingering injuries. I think it has the same effect, especially if you keep in mind how HP is stamina and not health points necessarily, right? But it's really up to the game you're running. I think there's like a pro and cons on this one. This is not necessarily outright bad like the inverted ranged combat thing. It really depends on the kind of game you're running and the kind of narrative style you as a DM want to go for.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
I just wanted to give an example. I've played in a game before, not D&D, but like Lord of the Rings RPG that I played, and there was a player who basically lost his feet for months of real time, for like multiple sessions, and there was a whole quest about like restoring them, and it was gonna take a while. So if a player is okay with it, you have to talk about it. I think first of all in session 0 we go back to that part. But another thing, like I think D&D just wasn't designed with it in mind, and this is a homebrew, and I don't think it fits with D&D. If you want to play something gritty, play a different system, I think. For example, in Rollmaster, which can be adapted to any fantasy or not a system, you have crit tables for every weapon, which is pretty cool for someone who likes like war games. And like, oh, I'm picking up this great axe because its crit table has cool effects like decapitation in it. But at the same time, in this system, you can be a high-level character, ambushed by goblins. The goblin rolls, you roll D100 in that system. The goblin rolls 100 on a hit, rolls very high on a crit table, and suddenly he just shot you in the brain, and you're dead. And you need a 20th level restore brain spell administered within 10 seconds, or your character is gone. So I don't think D&D was made for something like that.
Yeah, true. And that's actually a good tip in general. Don't be afraid of exploring different systems. Just because you started with D&D doesn't mean you have to stay with D&D if you find that certain aspects of it are not done in a way that you like. As long as you keep listening to this podcast, you can play whatever system. I don't mind.
Yeah, otherwise you lose that right.
Pretty much.
We'll have to talk about that in another episode, actually, of different role-playing systems. But for now, we've gone on lingering injuries, which can be, hit or miss. General consensus, I think, is avoid if you don't know exactly what you're doing. I'm gonna go back to some of the more classic rules, the easier ones in a way. Let's talk about mixing and matching attributes for skills. This is not necessarily even like a home rule. because in the DMG, actually, I believe, they talk about this. Using, for example, strength for intimidation, or using dexterity for investigation, or things like that. Pat, have you used this kind of home rule before?
I did. There was a couple of times, but not very often. Actually, my players usually know exactly what they want to roll, so they tell me they want to roll perception, and not that they are looking around. But where I can do it, I try to. I was thinking about the examples before, what you could do, and you could, for example, completely mix and match. I imagine athletics used with constitution instead of strength for like a long stretch of running or climbing. Because it's more about your overall body strength rather than like how much you can carry, how hard you can hit. Other things could include if you're like, let's say in a social meeting in a party and you're trying to make your like survive in the social environment or like try to get away from it all. You could maybe roll survival with charisma because you're trying to basically you're not really trying to perform anything. You're only trying to deceive anyone or to like persuade anyone, but you are trying to find your way to I don't know the or it could be like investigation with charisma, right? You're trying to find out who in this party is pulling all the strings or like is an important person to talk to. I think this actually comes from Vampire Masquerade. I think there you literally pick and choose every time someone rolls. The DM tells them what attribute it's going to be, and for some it's very obvious, and for some it's completely up to DM's choice. The game sort of leaves you to decide which tools, for example, which attributes they should be scales off from, and there's always a debate if thieves tools should be intelligence or dexterity, because are you figuring out the lock, or are you fiddling with the lock?
Right. That
I think
requires a lot of thinking, though.
Sure. But it should be. I think it should be used occasionally if you want to use it.
Yeah, I think if it comes up, you can use it. But on my part, like I have a very hard time running the game anyway. Like my mind is all over the place. I have to keep track of stuff left and right and center. And then introducing a rule like that where I have to really nitpick on what the player just described to me, what they're doing, and then I have to like think around three corners and not go, well, that's an easy intimidation, but be like, no, this is actually a strength type of intimidation. You know, that requires a lot of processing power that I, in my inexperience, don't believe I have. So I wouldn't use that rule. Is all I'm saying.
Right.
While I do like the concept of it.
My way of making that, that pressure that you have, or that the fact that you have to manage 10 things at once and avoiding having to think about all that, is generally that's basically left to the player. So I won't necessarily ask someone, for example, if someone tells me, I want to look around, I'm gonna roll me an investigation check. But if the player is specifically showing, I will go in front of the bouncer and make myself look as big as I can, and I'll say, move out the way, then I might go ahead and see if it's in the player's favor, first of all, because I feel like this rule might get a bad rap if you use it against your players in a way, like if you use it and it makes their role worse. But I think you can be pretty much free to use it whenever it makes their role better and it makes sense with the action that they're making. So for example, if they're purposefully describing, being physically intimidating, I might go ahead with it. And generally they give me the idea of what it's gonna be. And then, in rare cases, I'm gonna ask for a lockpicking check, like a Thief's Tools check using intelligence instead of dex, or, depending on the role. I think
I wouldn't worry about remembering to use it too much. Just like let it flow, and when you come up with it, oh, this is a good time to mix it up. I think it makes it interesting, and
Yeah, but that's my worry. I wouldn't be able to come up with
you don't think?
No, I literally do not think.
Shit. Well, sorry.
Yeah, I view it as more like a, like the icing on the cake, more than actually something that you have to like focus on.
Right.
You get used to it.
You use it as like flavor, like salt and pepper.
Exactly.
Yeah. That makes a lot more sense. But I would probably forget to salt my food, so
Well,
I like the rule, but I don't trust
That's
myself
fine. You don't have
enough.
to use
yeah,
it.
you don't have to use it. That's a good thing. It's a simple rule. You use it if you want. It might add something to your game, but if you don't want to use it or you feel like it's too much energy you're putting into it, just don't use it. And kind of like talking about DM spending energy, Nick, you run your games with a very specific house rules that actually I haven't seen used before. You roll insight checks in private behind the DM screen.
Yes,
So talk to us about it.
yes. That's my favorite rule of all time, because I accuse everyone of metagaming all the time, even though they're not. But I like to make I know myself. I try not to metagame, but I assume I subconsciously do, which is why I like this rule a lot. When you usually insight check someone and your player is suspicious of your NPC, it doesn't matter if he rolls a 2 or if he rolls a 20. The result doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Because even though you tell your player, your character thinks this NPC is truthful to the best of his ability, the player might go along with it. But down the line, to himself, he'll be thinking, I don't trust this NPC. I don't go along with this. And I'm thinking I'm forcing my players to better RP if I don't tell them what the inside roll was.
Oh
if
my
I
God.
just tell them the result. And that's my rationale behind using this rule and why I like it so much.
I think that makes sense. One thing I like, my version of doing exactly what you're doing is basically if you're rolling below the person, if you're like within 5 or you're pretty close, I might give some like a few hints, but not actually tell you like he looks suspicious. I'll tell you, he looks worried about something, but not necessarily spill the beans. And if you roll really low, generally I just use the Matt Mercer way of saying it, which is hard to read, which doesn't really say anything, and kind of helps avoid the metagaming issue. But I agree that using rolling insight behind the DM screen is very interesting because the players suddenly have to actually think more about the actual situation and not so much about the role itself. For example, if you roll like a 12, you might, and the DM tells you he seems relatively truthful. You're actually thinking about the role. You're thinking, did the DM say that to bait me or not? Like you're metagaming, as you said, Nick. And if the DM just tells you, well, he looks truthful. You don't know if you rolled a 1 or if you rolled a 20, and so you still have to think as a character because you don't have
Yes.
perfect information.
Exactly. I think that's a differentiation, because if I tell you the result, you think as a player, did the DM bait me? What does the 5 mean? What does the 20 mean? But if I don't tell you the roll result, you have to think as your character. Well, he's hard to read. Do I, as a character, trust NPCs that are hard to read, or would my character trust people like that? I think it makes a small but significant difference.
What about you, Pat? What do you
I
think?
will be I will be the odd one out. I like the rule. I'm not gonna ever implement it in my game.
How dare you?
Because I just, first of all, I don't want to roll for a player. This is part of the reason why I let the players roll secretly their death saves. I don't want to roll for them. I want them to roll for themselves. Maybe if I was playing a lot in IRL, I would just roll the dice in front of me, and it would be faster. But going into their character sheet and looking for their skills, it's too much work for me. The good thing about letting them roll is if you play it like this. Let's say they ask to insight. I take it if they say they're gonna roll insight, their character is already suspicious. So if they roll low, I'm not gonna give them any information. Maybe I'll describe a plausible reason why an NPC is acting weirdly. If they roll high, then I will either confirm or dismiss their suspicion, and I can know that either I was right or I was wrong because of their high insight. They notice like a key clue in the behavior of an NPC or a creature or something that lets them know that I was right. So if they roll an insight, they still get to be suspicious. It's not like now they believe them. That's not how it works in my game. They just don't know still. They can still lynch the guy and torture him for information, and it's not out of character. And if it is, I mean, I'm not gonna, how you said it, force my players to better RP.
Well, not better RP. I never said better. I'm just.
I wrote it down. It says better here on my paper.
I think you're remembering wrong. Anyway, but I want to interject there really quick because you mentioned something. I think our understanding of what insight is
I think that's
just differs, right? So where you're saying if they already if they want to check for insight, their character is already suspicious, and I'm thinking the player is suspicious and they want to roll insight to know if they have to RP their character is suspicious.
Sure.
Very well said.
That's more like passive insight, like they're inside everyone, and the character insides everyone, and player only asks for some of the roles.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean that works.
I agree with
I don't
that
think
take
there's anything wrong with it.
from Nick. I think at least in my experience, most of the time, it's like the player is suspicious, and he wants to know if he can, go with it in character, or if it's just the player having to be suspicious. Just like when you have, a low intelligence character and you were thinking of something smart, but then you gotta ask the DM, would I figure that out? So you can actually RP it. Alright, so we have differing, opinions on it. I don't know if I'll use it in my games, but I think it's definitely an interesting one. I might test it and see how well it does. But I like when in your games, Nick, we play with it. I like it. So I think, see with your table, ask your players.
I'm glad to hear that, actually, because I didn't ask for feedback on it yet.
I agree as a player. I don't mind if DM rolls secret stealth, secret insight. I just don't want to do it as a DM, and the gains of not metagaming are not worth it to me to go into trouble rolling it.
I'm a min-maxer. The marginal gains.
All right.
Well,
secret insight is there. We have a couple other things regarding attributes, and then we have we'll finish up with alternate combat rules. A couple of them. So, there is resting. We have. So resting in the wilderness or not allowing resting in the wilderness. This is basically a variant of gritty realism, if you want to see it that way. The home rule basically says, while the players are not in a safe space, which is usually a town or a castle, their safe house, I don't know, maybe a ship if they're at sea. If they're not in a comfortable and safe space, they cannot long rest. What this does is it extends the adventuring day, whereas normally your players would get their resources back once every day. Now, it might be several days out in the wilderness where they won't get their resources back. In essence, what it does is it makes days longer. And one of the reasons I appreciate that rule is because it allows you, especially as a DM, it's mostly like a DM rule, it allows you to spread out encounters over multiple days and still have their effects last on the characters. One of the big problems, and it's not really as much of a problem, but one of the things you have to worry about as a DM playing 5e is the game expects you to have multiple encounters a day. I have done, full-on boss fights with player being full rested in just one fight, but it's very swingy and it's difficult to design. And then the other problem is if you don't want that, then you gotta, wear down your players over multiple encounters and have maybe a few medium encounters before the boss. But then we run into the problem of realism or verisimilitude, where your players, the characters, it doesn't necessarily make sense that when they're traveling out in the wilderness, they are attacked 4 times every day. Because then, how the hell does anyone travel in this world if you're getting attacked 4 times every day by bandits and then wolves and then an ogre and then,
Well, that's why no one travels and only adventurers.
That is true. And
so, ogres are on every corner.
Yeah.
They should be, ogre. They should be. I'm totally with
in every swamp. But then the problem you also have is as a DM, you have a certain amount of time for a session. Combat tends to take a long time. So if you have 3 combat encounters before the boss, that's basically like a session that's gone. Just doing combat before the boss. And that's also a big problem. What do you guys think about that rule, Pat?
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But just
No, go ahead, Nick. You can go ahead.
But just, isn't that written in a DMG anyway? With like 3 to like 6 small encounters per day?
It's 6 to 8. That's the numbers they give.
See, like, right?
Yeah, but they're not all combat encounters. There could
6
be
to 8
meeting
encounters.
an NPC in the forest or something.
But they're meant to sab resources, aren't they?
Somewhat, yeah.
I think the way they're like written, even if it's just meeting an NPC, you're meant to spend resources on the encounters.
But balance-wise, yes, that's the reason you have so many.
Yes. So kind of goes into the long resting rule with just in safe space. It just makes everything longer.
I like the idea of the fact that you cannot rest in besides the city, because then you have to prepare for the adventure, leave the safety of the civilization, go deep into the uncharted territory, go into that cave, and then defeat something, and then come back. And with long resting everywhere almost, it either forces you to constantly attack players while they're trying to cast Tiny Hut, or you just have to let them have long rest every time. And what ends up happening inevitably is, well, you want the game to be interesting. So if we just go down to the combat encounters, which are the most resource intensive ones of all the encounter types you can have, you end up being, well, I could run this trivial encounter, this easy encounter, this medium encounter, but my players have magic items, they're gonna blast through it, then they're gonna long rest, and they're gonna go on their way. And it's gonna be boring. If you want it to be challenging, well, you have to make it deadly. A little bit deadly, at least. Usually, if players are experienced, deadly encounters won't even be that deadly in themselves. Well, then now they only encounter deadly threats wherever they go, because anything lesser would be just no fun to fight. So if you want to have a variety of encounters, have some weaker creatures, have some stronger creatures, then you need to have them all between the long rests, like packed into the same day or the same like length of time. It also allows other classes that regain things on short rest to shine more, because now the warlock, every time he sleeps, he gets his 2 spell slots back, so it makes him actually pretty powerful.
True, that is very true. But we're only talking about long rests with the homebrew rule, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the short resting is more viable, and I think it's an option that a lot of parties don't take advantage of often enough. Just short rest.
But basically, my thinking on it is, as you said, short rests don't get used as much. I think one of the reasons is when you can just long rest, why short rest? You know, if time isn't an issue, which most of the time it shouldn't be, at least, you know, you shouldn't be running after a time threat of I have to finish this within 3 hours every day. Otherwise, you know, the game gets kind of boring. And there are multiple issues which I'll talk about right after. But that means essentially this rule makes short rest classes much better, because as a fighter you get your second wind every day. You know, you might have one encounter for the day and get your short rest powers every day, and so that means, you know, you can go and blast, and the wizard can keep his spells for more important stuff. It also means travel might cost you resources more easily, because generally, you know, if the wizard can long rest every day, he's just gonna cast fly and you guys are gonna go over the mountain. But if you can't long rest out in the wilderness, then that means you gotta think, do I cast fly and then waste, you know, a 4th level slot for a couple of people, or depending on how you do it, do I spend spells fixing this problem, or do we find other ways, maybe creative ways, or maybe you spend other resources to do it? So I think it fixes a lot of the problems with resting.
True. But then again, are there a lot of problems with resting?
I believe so. As a DM, at least, that's a super long topic, but I believe there are problems with 5Vs, at least with the expected number of encounters per day and the way resources are spread out.
Yeah, making the long rest longer or available only in town helps with pacing as well because it divides game into, it like makes a very nice loop of gameplay, which is we're in town, we buy resources, we go out, we adventure, we get gold, we come back to town, we talk to NPCs, we buy resources. It's very clear what we're gonna do, and it also makes for like a better story if you can just long rest wherever. What like you're only gonna go to town to buy something. That way you can also make your players RP more because every adventure they come back to talk to someone.
How do you deal with multi-day adventures then, though?
I just make less encounters. Like if they go through the forest for a week, I don't have encounter every day. I have two encounters per week, and then they go to their destinations, and some of the resources are expended, and they do the actual quest. For example, it's a very bare example I'm giving, but
I,
that's how
I
the
realize that, yes. But I'm thinking, for example, in Axel's campaign, we're in the process of taking out a fortress, a military encampment, and we need multiple days for that, and we need more resources for that. And I'm thinking gameplay wise, you're limiting yourself to the amount of stuff you can throw at your party if they can't rest or long rest outside of towns. I guess it depends on what you define as safe spaces, right? So if, like obviously just napping in the forest, not a long rest, but actually setting up camp with alarm and traps and maybe a cave where there's only one entrance that's easily observable counts as a safe space with like not full long rest benefits but half or like 3/4 or whatever.
I can see like multiple ways of going around it. First of all, you would Axel, if he had this rule in his game, he would balance the fortress to be either beatable in one rest or it's a quest you have to come back to. You defeated some of the defenses, go back, rest, come back, defeat the rest. That's why I would do anyway. You can also have a witch hut in the woods that after some demonic deal she lets you rest in her hut and no monsters come close because she's evil and they don't want to fuck with her. There's ways to do it. You could even go a way of having a magical item that sprouts a house for 24 hours that you can sleep in, but it's like one time use, so you have to spend gold for it. So I don't know.
Basically, I agree exactly with Pat what he said, and that's what I was gonna say as well. Then your margin as a DM is playing with like what is gonna be a safe space and how safe is this land gonna be. And I think it also makes for interesting stuff in terms of theming because all of a sudden you can have, for example, the main country where this is happening with your adventurers guild and your towns. You go out of town, you walk for a couple of days, fight this demon in the woods or this corrupted druid or anything, come back to town, rest up, and you can go back easily after each adventure. But then you might have this very dangerous enemy territory where you have very few places you can rest, and so you either have to keep that in mind and make do more surgical missions where you avoid more dangers and you have specific targets that you go, you hunt, and then you come back to your safe space, or it forces you to maybe do deals with other people. As Pat said, protection from a witch or from a body of guards that are there. Maybe a caravan can keep you safe at night, or things like that. And it gives you options as a DM to introduce other encounters that are based on the need to rest, and that's interesting.
I like that. That's just boggles my mind as a new DM because I have no clue what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
it's because resting is a mechanic that I haven't really thought about it.
Yeah.
But that's definitely an interesting take.
It's definitely something you have to think about a bit more, and maybe maybe it's easier if you have a bit more experience as a DM, but it gives you a lot of leeway. And I will say the most important point I want to make about this, which I think is going to change my new campaign compared to the first one I made, is that it spreads out time a lot more. What happened in my first campaign was that from beginning to end, it lasted in-game about 4 months, and it lasted 2 years in real life. Basically, the players went from level 1 to level 13 in 4 months of in-game time. So they were basically like just running from one thing to another every day or teleporting and never resting for more than a couple of days, which I feel narratively just impacts the feeling of the game in a negative way. Because, for example, you have a war going on. It's not going to be finished in 2 months, and nothing is going to change in 2 weeks, Whereas if you have to go back, for example, you go into the desert, journey is going to be a week. You have 2 encounters during this week. Then you arrive, fight the Ankeg, or maybe you have a longer arc, and then come back, and maybe like a month or more has passed between just this adventure, And it gives you time as a DM to introduce longer term things that come through during the campaign. It gives your players downtime as well, because as you're, if you're traveling, maybe you have I don't know, maybe you have a cart and there's just one dude who stays in the cart and just crafts stuff during the day while they're being carried. It gives opportunities to spread out time, which is, I think, one of the hardest things to do as a DM, especially in 5e.
Yeah, it actually makes DMings easier, basically, is what it does. I don't have to stress out about giving enough or too little encounters, because the span of the in-game time is so long that I can decide exactly, or I can roll, or I can decide exactly how many encounters I want to have. They're not all the same day. I can have the party travel for vast distance, only have 2 encounters, so the forest isn't just teeming with monsters on every corner. And then at the end, the encounters mattered because the resources they expended matters, and the information or whatever they gathered is, I don't know, it feels better as a DM, and I think it works.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good...
It just works.
It just works. I think that's a pretty good conclusion on this. Gives you freedom as a DM, gives you options, but you got to think about it a bit more. But definitely, keep in mind, this is a role you can use in your games if you feel the same problems that we feel we have. I think that we pretty much talked about everything regarding that. There's one last rule that I wanted to talk about regarding non-combat stuff, which is a rule I use in my games, and I stole from someone else on the internet, which is prep points. Basically what those are you have a number of prep points equal to your intelligence modifier, and what they allow you to do is to retcon something, to maybe have a flashback or say that this happened in the past while you're doing something. So let me give an example to clarify. Let's say we're stealthing into the fortress of Gardul, which is a very evil orc leader. I'm stealthing here, and then I realize there's a big wall in front of me. I didn't bring my climbing equipment. Well, you can use one of your prep points to retcon the fact that you would have bought climbing equipment because your character is pretty smart. That's what he would do. The advantages and the reasons you do this is because it saves you time of boring preparation or shopping, that could be happening off screen. You can just have a few things that you don't need to think about everything as a player, and that makes you more relaxed. Your worst case, you can just use your prep points to get the stuff that you missed. Second thing, it makes intelligence more useful, and it makes intelligent characters feel like they're more intelligent. Even if the player is not necessarily a genius, your intelligence character would have thought about this thing that you need to do and this thing that you need to do, and so that gives you kind of that feeling of being a mastermind in a way. And then it also makes your life a bit easier as a DM, because if there's like an obstacle that you didn't think would be an obstacle, but it turns out like it's slowing the game down, you can just kind of help the players in a way that makes sense. Nick, we've played with them a tiny bit in recent sessions in the campaign that we played together in. What do you think about that rule?
Well, you had me where you said the player might not necessarily be a genius, but your character is. And I'm all in favor of bridging that divide between character and player. And I do that with knowledge the character would have because it lives in the world and the player does not. And I also tend to do that with stats or attributes that the character has that are hard to play as a player. If you're a 10 int person, it's hard to play a 20 int wizard The same way it's hard to play in a 5-int barbarian to dish out some stereotypes there. And it always, like, we all know this when we like watch Sherlock Holmes or something. Like, often it's regular people writing smart people how they believe smart people act instead of smart people writing smart people. So bridging that divide is great, and I love the prep ones.
Can you give an example from your game or rather someone else's game? Because I was thinking how would I implemented it or use it.
One example, like a very simple example that we had was there's a character called Abigail. She's a rabbit folk druid in my game, played by a friend of ours. And she was preparing her spells, and middle of the day, after some stuff had already happened during the day, she figured out, oh snap, I forgot to prep that spell for today. I wanted to use it, but I forgot to prep it, and I prepped another one instead. And so what you can do is use one of your prep points to say, well, I would have thought of that this morning before prepping my spells, because my character, he does that or she does that every day. So they would know kind of what they would need in this circumstance, and so you can switch it up. Of course, if you use the spell before, for example, I prep Fireball, I use Fireball, and then I'm like, oh no, I should have prepped Blur instead. If you use the spell, you can change it, but if it makes sense that you could have, swapped it out, then you can.
Yeah, okay, that's actually pretty cool. And it works even better with the long rest rule, because you don't spam the prep points every day. I like it. I have never used it. I've seen a similar feature in another system. I don't remember which one. Might have been Apocalypse World or something. But it was well, you would roll a skill check. A specific class had this feature. It wasn't like everyone, but someone was an intelligent class, and they would basically be always prepared. They could roll. Oh, I think it was a steampunky game. Anyway, you could roll, and if you succeeded, well then yeah, you prepared it in advance. We retcon that you yeah actually have it, and maybe even roleplay how you got it if you really want to get into it. So I think that's a good mechanic. Maybe I would have it rolled because it feels very generous. But maybe everyone just dumps int and it really needs a boost. But Axel's dying. Okay, I'll just ramble on.
Yes,
Um,
please do.
but I think it. I think I would have a difficult time introducing this rule to players. I think they would just forget. And at this point, everyone just dumps int anyway. So maybe if I make a new game, I'll give it a try.
But just to the end character? So what do you mean by dumping int?
I don't know. Let me think. I think one person has more than 10 int in my campaign.
Okay. How
Because
do
I
you...
don't have a wizard.
Right. But would you tie that to a feat? Like Keen Mind, maybe?
That would be really. Actually, that's a good. It's like foresight. Actually, is what it is. Could be
True.
called like foresight
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah. Make it a feat that you can take instead of just a game, like instead of a house rule. But that's, I think, a topic for a different episode.
It could be +1 to int or wiz, because I feel like a wise character could always be always prepared. You know what I mean? Like.
Yeah, I guess. I like the prep ones though, because you don't necessarily have to use them for just spells. But could also be like, well, this morning I would have grabbed my second shield that has better AC but is vulnerable against fire, because I figured we would go against fire, non-fire breathing lizards or something. It doesn't have to be about wizards and their spells necessarily. It can be about everything.
I know, but it actually. When I think about like preparing spells, it always feels like you have too few spells prepared,
True,
and having the ability to just pick one
it does.
seems very strong.
Which
So I would be willing on a cleric or a druid to even put some points into it just to be able to pick a spell once per day or any other circumstance.
And this is way left field, way out there, right? But we talked about making this a fate. But what about making this a custom spell for a divination wizard that he can cast on the party? Think about that.
Yeah, you cast it at the beginning of the day, and then it's like a buff. Whenever you get to that point, you can be like,
Yes.
I knew it. I cast it in the
Yeah,
morning.
it's like Portent, but different.
Yeah, I foreseen it. Therefore, I have it.
Yes.
That's really. Oh,
That's
I like
actually
it.
really
I'm gonna make that custom spell. I'm gonna make that custom spell.
That's great.
Yeah, and I like, Pat, the extension that you said about, being able to know that you can pick a spell later. I think that's actually a real good point. That's even better if you you can do it and you play around it, because then that means you can kind of like prepare multiple things. Well,
I will say it's a huge boost to a wizard who has the most spells of all casters and the highest end.
That's exactly what I was worried about.
I would consider making it like a feat or custom class feature for some people. I don't know. Maybe a rogue could have it, because the rogue like supposed to be clever. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. The initial
intent
of the rule was in case people forget, but it was supposed to be not abusable, because as a DM, if you realize someone is trying to abuse it and is spamming it or is trying to change their spells every day, then you'd probably tell them, well, today unfortunately you forgot to prepare that one because you should have figured it out after forgetting a few times. But I feel like it might actually be interesting to just use as a boon that you can give your players. Maybe they can be something like NPC related, or they have like an NPC that's their secretary and just makes lists of stuff they shouldn't forget, and because they have the NPC, maybe they have a plot point. But we're getting.
What about? Mm-hmm. What about? Sorry to get another tangent.
No worries.
But we need an extra long episode because there was a few of them. What about replacing inspiration with foresight? And so you reward people with foresight, which means that the next time they forget something because they roleplay so well or whatever, you like them. I know people vote for it sometimes. They can do exactly what you said, and maybe you roll at d20 plus int or something. I don't know, but I feel like that would be a good way to reward players without giving them very powerful like item or like just money. Just giving like some foresight points.
I agree. Yeah, that could be interesting, even as a magical item. Maybe your reward for helping the old Sphinx is that he gives you the Book of Foresight, and every day you open it and he says you're gonna forget your shoes, and then you don't forget your shoes because you have it.
That's such a fucking cool idea. That's like I can imagine like a whole class or a subclass. I know you have already divination.
Now we're getting into it.
That could be interesting.
I love this idea. I don't know about implementing it like you said. Maybe even a new game, but I love the toying with this idea now.
Well, what we can do is we can think about it, and then we can have people, if any of you watching are interested in this idea or have ideas, just put it in the comments. And if you see any problems with it, which there probably are, then put it in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think about all these rules, and even the ones that we didn't talk about that you guys use in your games. Just go ahead and mention it to us.
Do tell us in the comments or on Twitter at Cardinal Direct 3.
Indeed.
Don't forget to hit us up. We have 0 followers. Before I die, I'd like at least one.
That'd be very nice. All right. Well, having finished with the prep points, let's go into, I think, what we can conclude with. A few alternate combat rules. So, it's going to be flanking, it's going to be cold shots, and cleaving attacks. Let's talk about the easiest ones first, cleaving attacks. So, Nick, could you explain to us the concept?
Yes, whenever you deal more damage than hit points remaining on the mob that you attacked, the leftover damage gets hit or assigned, for lack of a better word, to a nearby enemy. So, example, you hit a kobold who has 3 HP left for 10 damage. The 7 damage that you have left over get dealt to the kobold left to it, who now has 7 damage. That's the cleaving rule. Makes it more powerful and your attacks more meaningful to, not waste anything. And it streamlines combat because, every single point of damage gets dealt.
That's true. there's disadvantage, and I think it's cool in a way because it makes fighting more cinematic. Because we've all seen in superhero movies or anime, you have your protagonist who is a sword master and is just slashing through hundreds of foes. But then in D&D, you have your level 20 fighter who gets, I believe, 4 attacks, and he can kill 4 kobolds. Whereas the wizard can kill thousands of kobolds with like Mario Swarm or any, fireball. It gives you some form of AoE as a melee character, and it makes it cool when you instead of slashing 1 kobold, you slash 3 kobolds because you do so much damage.
And we all know 3 is better than 1.
That is true. Literally.
Undeniable. Well, this is already actually an optional rule in DMG.
Oh,
right? Cleaving. It's not.
Is
Yeah,
it?
I just
I didn't
found.
know.
I just googled it. Yes.
No, go away. It's homebrew. Optional
It's
rules
homebrew.
don't
Yeah, ours is
exist.
homebrew because you add +1 damage. And there's a battle master maneuver for cleaving as well, which isn't very good, I don't think. I think the rule is fine. I think it's a cool idea of having like the barbarian to cleave through 4 enemies in front of him with 1 axe swing instead of wasting his whole damage on 1 like weak skeleton or something. So I don't think it's broken. I think it's fine to insert it in the game, and I think it's fine without it as well. I would probably, if I run like minions and I had someone like fight in melee, I would just you hit multiple enemies and they all destroy. Just cinematically describing the fight at that point. But it's a fine rule. I don't really feel like I should implement it in my game, but it's a fine rule.
Yeah, I have the same verdict. It's not necessary, but it gives a little oomph to martials, makes it a bit more cool mechanically, and you don't have to rely on the DM to do it for you.
Making a cool cleaving weapon, like enchanting cleaving weapon, is another way to go about it.
Yeah, totally. Or having, I've seen some people give battle maneuvers to all martials in a limited way. Like for example, fighters to all fighters. Sorry. So just all fighters get a couple of maneuvers, and then they have a couple of superiority dice. I think it's something to be tinkered with in your own campaign, depending on the setting and the theming of the campaign. That might change. All right. Well, that one is pretty quick. So for do it if you want to. It's not necessary. What about this one? Is very controversial. What about cold shots? In my experience, I hate them. But what do you guys think about them?
What's the rule again? Remind me.
So that depends on the tables, but generally, you can make a cold shot against a specific part of the body of an enemy in combat. So, for example, I can decide I will try and shoot it in the hand, and I take either disadvantage, a -5, or other malices to the roll, and then if I hit, I do an additional effect. So it might be disarming, it might be blinding the target, stunning, pushing someone prone. Some DMs might even say that if you do enough damage to a specific part, it is destroyed and then they lose the ability. So if you do enough damage to the arm, maybe the arm is cut off and then they only have 1 arm. So that's the rule in general. It has problems.
What's the point of doing that?
Well, you have creatures that have, I don't know, certain parts of bodies that do certain things. I imagine, I mean, usually the attacks are not that strong to warrant like the cutting off of a limb, but you could imagine like, oh well, you have a beholder who has like eye stalks, and if you cut off eye stalks, then they don't use as many rays maybe per round, right? That could be like an ability tied to a body part. The problem is, how do you rule it? You have to come up with your own specific way and then stick to it. I like the rule in general. Spoilers for Critical Role episode 100 something, but in that episode they fight like a creature who has a bulb in front of his face, and the bulb has magical effect that is very like bad for the party, and so they decide to cut it off to make the fight easier. I think that's great. I think that's a cool thing to do. I would allow it as a DM, but I will have to on the spot decide because I don't have that rule. Oh wait, how much damage they have to do to the bulb, and to finally cut it off. So I was thinking maybe like 20%. You could like argue 20% of max health is like cutting off a limb of or something. Or maybe you do half damage to the monster, but you do full damage to the limb, and then you just decide on the spot how much health the limb has. Um, Other things similar to cold shot attacks could be like when you, for example, you fight a octopus or a kraken, and someone gets grappled by a tentacle. Well, you try to ungrapple them by cutting off the tentacle, right? And that you have to decide if it's a strength check against the tentacle, if it's just enough damage to the tentacle. I think it's gone. Sorry.
No, like you said, I feel like most damage is not high enough to warrant cutting off limbs. What I would do instead is just have tentacles or like body parts have extra HP. I like this might be a Blood Soul or a Dark Soul or Monster Hunter thing, right? But if you want to cut off a tail, the tail has 30 HP and the monster itself has like 97 or whatever, right? But they're like separate from each other, right? Is what I'm thinking. I don't like this culture. It's no, it's extremely weird unless there's narrative purpose for it, like an enemy is holding a gun and you want to shoot out the gun, you know. But no, I'm not a fan actually.
I have issues with it myself because I feel like it either steps on the toes of many other things. Like, for example, disarming. There's Battlemaster who can disarm. There are other classes that have stuff that can disarm, and that's their shtick. So I feel like just giving everyone the ability to do it, it's kind of like, also, it makes you do so much work as a DM because you gotta figure out every fight. During the fight, does that guy's arm have like 35 HP or 40 HP, or like how much does it take to be cut off, and what does it do once it's cut off? My player wants to shoot the ear of the monster. Is that gonna deafen it? Like, what's it gonna do? You know, so you gotta think about all of these things, and then even then, it's either super good and then you do it all the time and players only do it basically, or it sucks and it doesn't do enough to justify the big disadvantage that you're giving. I think it's really hard to balance because, for example, a lot of cold shot rules have, if you shoot an enemy in the head, for example, they might get stunned or dazed or blinded. But then that's pretty powerful, right? If you can just shoot a guy in the head and blind it, especially when you have multiple attacks and stuff. And then either it's doable, and then of course they're gonna do it because that's such a huge advantage, or it's super hard to do, and then they're not gonna do it because they're wasting damage and they could be doing something else. It also has problems with the narrative sense of HP because most of the time you're not actually getting hit, so it would be weird if you take like 10 damage to your head and it does something to you when you're not even supposed to have been grazed by the bullet. And then finally, I had another thought that just went off into the ether. So, Pat, you want to say something?
Yeah, so regular combat rules already account for some of it, right? When you shoot at someone with an arrow, the fact that you hit a very vulnerable spot is that when you roll a natural 20 and you crit. So, and then you don't blind them as suddenly, unless they're also dying in the same round. So the system just doesn't have these features, and there's several, like you said, several class features, which is like disarming strike, or maybe there's some blinding arrow or something, or like an item that you can get. I'm not exactly sure. So now being able to just blind, it's like crits on demand, like, oh, I want to try and crit them so they debilitate it somehow. So and then also if you already have the lasting injuries on enemies, well, now you're trying to just inflict the lasting injury without like critting or whatever. It's just crazy at that point. Play a system like Rollmaster where you always roll on a crit table and you always hit a liver or a spleen and not just their body, and that way it's easier.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so those cold shots we don't recommend, though your mileage may vary depending on what kind of game you run. But in general, especially if you're a new DM, I would say avoid cold shots, avoid lingering injuries table or crit tables, because generally they're not balanced in a way that will make your life easier, and your players might, feel like, it's something they can use and use it, and that might cause you trouble. So in general, I'd say myself stay away from it for the moment.
Can I add one more?
Mm-hmm, of course.
But if it narratively makes sense and it's fun, and the player just wants to like cut off that tail or that eye stalk from the beholder instead of, I'd say let them figure out, like just quickly figure out what they're doing. Don't just say no to them because it's a cool idea. Maybe not blind the beholder completely, but yeah.
Yeah, don't be afraid to use rule of cool, and sometimes it makes calls in the moment, but it's easier if it's just a one-time thing to manage as DM than if it's an actual rule that you gotta use all the time. All right, so that was cold shots. And the last thing that we want to talk about today is alternate flanking rules. Generally, at least it's an optional rule already in the DMG of gaining advantage if another of your allies is flanking the same target as you, which means being on the other side of it and within 5 feet of it or engaged in melee combat. I personally feel like advantage is too much, and there are too many things that give advantage in the game, and so it kind of stacks with itself. So what I do personally is I give +2, but I've heard that you guys have other interpretations of it. Nick, you talked about triple teaming. So can you quickly mention or explain your concept?
Triple teaming.
Triple teaming. It sounds very naughty, but I can assure you that it isn't. It just means that when a creature and 2 of its allies have an enemy within their reach, melee attack rolls against that enemy have advantage, and ranged attack rolls against that enemy are made with disadvantage. There's a theme with the rules that I'm proposing, that they're supposed to make things more realistic, in case you haven't noticed. So imagine if you're flanking someone left and right and center, the enemy will have a hard time focusing on all of the attacks that are coming in. So gaining advantage on the attack seems plausible, but it's also crowded, that space. So having ranged attacks made with disadvantage or the possibility of hitting an ally, very realistic in my mind, which is where the rule comes from.
Gameplay wise, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
Too polite.
No, you go.
Too polite.
No, you go.
Gameplay-wise, it's similar to what we talked about a bit earlier in Pathfinder. You have precise shot that allows you to not have a negative when you're shooting to people that are active in melee. And I think in terms of realism, this rule makes sense. I don't quite know of the implications on balance this has. So this would be something that had to be monitored a bit because I feel like you need a bit of experience with it to figure out really how does that affect ranged combat? Does that, render some of your classes way less powerful? And in a sense, it might. Let's imagine you have a party of fighter, ranger, cleric, warlock, for example. Fighter is going to be running in melee with people. Imagine he's in melee with a boss, for example, and there's the ranger familiar on the other side. The fact that they're in melee, that's kind of necessary for them to do damage, but then that also means the ranger always has disadvantage on attacks, which might be rough considering that he doesn't really have a choice. In this circumstance, I talked about like an animal companion, but let's say it's another PC, You can't really stop them from going into melee, but then that also means you get disadvantage all the time.
True. All right, let me, before you go in there, Pat, let me propose one change already. Make it more battle map focused in the way that you can choose to just, if we have a battle map, there are 9 squares around an enemy where you can engage in melee, right?
8.
That is mathematically correct. 8, because the 9th square is occupied by the character.
Indeed.
8.
Traditionally.
Thank you very much, Pat. I don't do
problem.
math.
That's what I'm here for.
Perfect. So I'm saying, I need to draw this for myself because I'm confusing myself right now. But if you just occupy, no, I'm kidding. If you just occupy squares and your ranger has a clear line of sight, no disadvantage. But also no advantage. It makes battle maps more engaging because now positioning matters. And previously, in my combats and in combats that I've been part of as a player, positioning was willy-nilly except for cover.
Yeah. I think it is the change that you're proposing actually makes the rule a lot better because the players have an agency and you never feel bad. You can choose and talk to the other players and see if they should flank. There is one disadvantage, which is it might take a bit more time because then the players have to focus more on positioning, but that's not necessarily something that's bad. It might just be what you prefer. Pat, what did you think about
Pat,
it?
you don't sound convinced. You
I
don't
don't
look
know.
convinced.
Yeah.
A lot of thoughts. First of all, well, we have flanking in our Tomb of Annihilation game, and I've noticed the monk in our party that puts a lot of effort into positioning and to get advantage, and I think that's cool. On the one hand, I think advantage is a very big bonus, and it's very swingy because I find in my game my players will often either fight a swarm of enemies that is going to, especially if there's only one melee fighter or two, they're gonna get surrounded by most of the time in that scenario if there's more enemies. Or they're fighting one boss and then the boss is getting surrounded, and it's also not good for like the balancing thing. They either always are attacked with advantage or attacking with advantage. So I think +2 to attack is pretty good for the balance if you want to have flanking baseline. +2 is a reasonable amount. The enemies with +2 will have slightly higher chance of hitting. You have slight incentive to move, but not game breaking. It's good. If you want to stick to advantage disadvantage, I think it's advantages. I think it's a too big of a bonus. I would maybe think about making it a feat to take for a player. If he wants to flank, he can take a feat. And then he has advantage of like 50% of the time when he can position himself, which is pretty good for having a feat to get just reroll on your attack all the time if you don't have an easy way to get it. Or I don't know, triple teaming also could be a feat, although that's a bit harder to get. It also depends on the size of your party, the amount of melee attackers you have. Putting a penalty for shooting into melee, like in Pathfinder, it seems very harsh from my point of view. And there's so many rules. At that point, I suggest to anyone who loves like all these battle rules to just play Pathfinder, the new edition that came out a couple years ago.
Are you trying to tell me something here?
I sensed a theme of certain homebrew rules coming from certain video game over the course of last hour.
You say that, but I'm just thinking about keeping my game realistic. It has nothing to do. To be fair, I haven't touched that video game in like 2 weeks. That's all I'm saying.
Well, if you want the game to be realistic, some of these home rules that we talked about are gonna make the game more realistic, and if that's what the players are into, then it's gonna work great. Flanking is a lot of work. It's fine if all my players ask me to put flanking in game, I will. But I won't do it by default because I don't think it's worth it. Or maybe I would do +3.
That's what makes you the DM. It's your choice.
But it's not because I'm not the only player. It would be shitty to just be like, deal with it.
No, but you can just pre-select players that would deal
with
it.
All my monsters are immune to flanking, you know?
Yeah, like they exactly.
Totally natural.
Flanking immunity.
No, first you make the fighter take a feat. And then all the monsters are immune to flanking. Otherwise, how does he know you're the boss? You gotta show
Nothing
it.
Personal, kid.
Yeah. So to anyone listening, please do not take this advice as real advice. This is very bad advice. Talk to your players, see what they would like. Yeah. For that rule, I think like generally I kind of like avoid flanking because I think it's work that doesn't need to be there. Because if the monster have it and the players have it, kind of equals out, and then that just means I have to constantly like think about flanking, which I don't really want to do. So true. I won't propose it, but if someone wants to use it, I'll give it to them. And as I said, +2 is what I'm using. Well, I think we've cleared. Sorry, go ahead, Nick.
No, that's what I was going to say. I think that's a wrap, guys. Or are there any rules that we have missed? Well, there are so many more that we can read up on in the comments and on Twitter at Cardinal Direct3. But it's really all that we thought about before coming together And I actually took away some good advice here, which I'm
yeah.
looking to implement into my game, especially with this new divination wizard subclass. That's super interesting.
Or like a magic item or something. Yeah, that would be really good.
That, by the way, you could also what we talked about. It was what was the thing? The fighter thing. Just a quick addendum. Not
cleaving, or?
Not the cleave rules, or yes, actually the cleave rules. also cleave rules. You could also just, instead of making these rules, if you like a part of it, make it a custom magic item and give it to your player.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is a very good tip, Nick. Yeah, if you have anything you'd like to test out before implementing it as a rule, maybe, you can make it a custom feat, you can make it a magical item, and always talk to your players. And, if you're not sure about something, tell them, look, I'm testing this thing. It might not work, might not be fun, might not be better than what we have now. So worst case, we might remove it once we use it for a bit and we see. That's the lesson of today.
Key.
Communication is key. Talk to your players and make sure that all of this is something that is you have in common with your players, that they know about. And that way, even if you have a problem, you can probably talk through it. Cardinal Directions, always the best advice. So, on that note...
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nick has something to say?
I'm just agreeing with you, because
Okay.
the advice is impeccable. It's great.
Agreement everywhere here. That's perfect. That's why we're here. So we will end today's podcast here. We don't know what the next topic is going to be. You don't know either. So leave us a comment if you want to, change it up and you want us to tackle a specific topic. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Buzzsprout. And I guess we'll see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.